The morning of August 1st, 1943, and Captain Harold Wickland was about to make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He sat in the Navigator's station of a B-24 Liberator called THAN, watching the Romanian countryside blur past at 300 feet. In the cockpit above him, Colonel Compton gripped the controls, while Brigadier General Uzal Ent leaned over his shoulder, both men squinting through the haze at a small town emerging from the landscape ahead. Wickland had seen this town before, not physically, but on the sand table models they'd studied for weeks in the Libyan desert. He'd memorized every road, every railroad junction, every geographic feature between the Danube River and the oil refineries at Ploesti. And he knew with absolute certainty that the town rushing toward them was Târgoviște, not Ploesti. They were 30 miles short of their final turning point. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. "Sir," Wickland called through the intercom, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "That's not the IP. We need to continue north." Compton didn't respond. Ent was pointing at something out the window, talking rapidly. At precisely 2:45 in the afternoon, Compton banked THAN hard to the southeast. Behind him, 40 B-24 seconds of the 376 bombardment group followed their leader into the wrong turn. The 93rd Bomb Group, flying in tight formation behind them, turned as well. 120 bombers, carrying over 1,200 American airmen and 500 tons of bombs, were now flying away from their targets and directly toward Bucharest, the capital of Romania and the headquarters of German air defenses in the region. The carefully rehearsed plan for Operation Tidal Wave, the most ambitious bombing raid yet, attempted in the war, had just collapsed into chaos, and the men flying these aircraft wouldn't realize the magnitude of the error for another 15 minutes, when it would be far too late to fix it without catastrophic consequences. The question isn't whether a band star chart let B-24 seconds bomb Ploesti from 50 feet in total darkness. The question is why 177 heavy bombers flew 1,200 miles in broad daylight to attack the most heavily defended target in Europe at an altitude lower than most church steeples, and how a single navigation error transformed a meticulously planned mission into what would be remembered as Black Sunday, the bloodiest single-day air raid in American military history. To understand how American airmen ended up flying into a firestorm at treetop level on that August afternoon, you have to go back 9 months to a conference room in Morocco, where two men were staring at a map and trying to figure out how to shorten World War II by 6 months, January 1943, and the Casablanca Conference brought together Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and their military staffs to plan the next phase of the war against Nazi Germany. The North African campaign was nearing its conclusion. Sicily would be next, then Italy. But the strategic bombing campaign against German industry was just beginning, and the target list being compiled by Allied planners included one location that appeared again and again in intelligence assessments: Ploesti, Romania, a city of 100,000 people located 30 miles north of Bucharest in the foothills of the Transylvanian Alps. Most Americans had never heard of it, but to anyone who understood the logistics of mechanized warfare, Ploesti was one of the most important pieces of real estate in Europe. The city and its surrounding area contained 7 major oil refineries: Astra Română, Româno-Americana, Concordia Vega, Standard Petrol Bloc, Unirea Orion, Columbia, Aquila, and Creditul Minier. These facilities weren't just refineries in the modern sense. They were vast industrial complexes, each covering hundreds of acres, containing dozens of specialized buildings, cracking towers that broke crude oil into usable fractions, distillation plants that separated gasoline from kerosene, boiler houses that generated the steam to drive the entire operation, storage tanks holding millions of gallons of refined products. Together, these refineries produced approximately 9 million tons of petroleum products per year. British intelligence estimated that represented between 30 and 35% of all refined oil available to Germany and its allies. Fuel for the Luftwaffe's fighters and bombers, diesel for the Wehrmacht's tanks and trucks, lubricating oil for every piece of German machinery from U-boats to factory equipment. Cut off Ploesti's supply, Allied planners reasoned, and you cripple Germany's ability to wage mechanized warfare. The panzer divisions grinding across the Russian steppes would run out of fuel. The Luftwaffe's bomber formations would be grounded. The U-boats stalking Allied convoys would sit idle in port. It was a strategic choke point whose destruction could potentially shorten the war by months, saving hundreds of thousands of lives. There was just one small problem. Ploesti was 1,200 miles from the nearest Allied airbase in North Africa, 1,300 miles from England. It sat beyond the effective range of every Allied bomber except one, the consolidated B-24 Liberator. Even the Liberator could barely make the round trip. The aircraft had been designed as a long-range maritime patrol bomber, with massive fuel capacity and range that exceeded the more famous B-17 Flying Fortress. Fully loaded with fuel and a modest bomb load, a B-24 could theoretically reach Ploesti from Libya, drop its bombs, and return. Theoretically. In practice, the mission would push the Liberator to its absolute limits. Every aircraft would need to be fitted with additional fuel tanks in the bomb bays, reducing the bomb load. The crews would fly for over 7 hours, much of it over enemy-occupied territory with no fighter escort. Navigation would need to be perfect, because wandering off course could mean running out of fuel over the Mediterranean on the return flight. And then there was the target itself. By 1943, Ploesti was the second most heavily defended location in Europe, after Berlin. German intelligence had known since 1942 that the Allies considered the refineries a prime target. In June of that year, 13 B-24s from the Halvorsen project, a small detachment originally destined for operations against Japan, had made a hasty raid on Ploesti from bases in Egypt. The attack had done minimal damage, but it had alerted the Germans to the threat. General Alfred Gerstenberg, the German air commander in Romania, had spent the following year turning Ploesti into a fortress. His defensive network included over 200 anti-aircraft guns, ranging from small-caliber automatic weapons to the dreaded 88mm Flak 18 and Flak 38 heavy guns that could shred a bomber at altitudes up to 30,000 feet. The guns were positioned not just around the refineries, but on the surrounding hills, giving them overlapping fields of fire. Gerstenberg didn't stop at anti-aircraft guns. He installed smoke generators throughout the refinery complexes, capable of producing dense artificial fog that would obscure targets from bombardiers. He positioned 3 fighter groups within quick response range of Ploesti: 52 Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Bf-110 fighters, plus Romanian aircraft. He even had some of the anti-aircraft guns disguised in damaged buildings, haystacks, and wrecked vehicles, so attacking aircraft wouldn't see them until they started firing. Allied intelligence knew Ploesti was heavily defended. What they didn't know was exactly how heavily. The estimates being passed to mission planners significantly underestimated both the number of guns and the skill of the German and Romanian defenders. Into this strategic puzzle stepped Colonel Jacob Smart, a 33-year-old operations officer on General Henry Hap Arnold's staff. Smart had been tasked with planning the most effective way to destroy the Ploesti refineries, and in the spring of 1943, he proposed something that contradicted every doctrine the Army Air Forces had developed. The American approach to strategic bombing was built on high-altitude precision attacks. B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds would fly at 20,000 feet or higher, above the effective range of most anti-aircraft fire, and use their Norden bomb sights to precisely target specific buildings. The theory was that altitude provided safety, and precision meant you could destroy critical components, rather than just dropping bombs randomly on industrial areas. Smart looked at Ploesti and concluded that high-altitude precision bombing wouldn't work. The refineries were too complex. Hitting a boiler house or cracking tower from 20,000 feet, even with the vaunted Norden sight, was a matter of probability and luck. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. You might hit it, or you might miss by hundreds of yards. And given the distance to the target, The air forces couldn't mount repeated raids the way they were doing against targets in Germany. This would likely be a one-shot mission. Smart's proposal was radical. Attack at extremely low altitude, below 500 feet, approaching the target at treetop level. The bombers would fly so low that anti-aircraft guns wouldn't have time to track them effectively. The accuracy would be visual, not dependent on bomb sites. Bombardiers could literally see their targets through the haze and smoke, could verify they were hitting the right building before releasing their bombs. The proposal generated immediate controversy. Low-level attacks were considered suicide missions for heavy bombers. The aircraft were too big, too slow, too vulnerable to small-caliber fire that could chew through aluminum skin at close range. High-altitude doctrine existed for a reason. It kept bombers away from the worst of the defensive fire. But Smart had compelling arguments. The element of surprise would be total. German radar couldn't effectively track aircraft flying at treetop level because ground clutter obscured the returns. The formations would pop up over the horizon only minutes before reaching their targets, giving defenders minimal time to react, and the accuracy would be unprecedented. Instead of hoping to hit a specific building from 4 miles up, bombardiers would be releasing weapons from 500 feet or less, where they could see their aiming points clearly. The briefings made their way up the chain of command. General Arnold reviewed the plan. It went to the combined chiefs of staff. Churchill himself weighed in, initially objecting to the mission's code name, Soapsuds, as insufficiently dramatic for such an important operation. The name was changed to Tidal Wave. In May 1943, Eisenhower gave final authorization. The mission was approved for August 1st, timed to hit on a Sunday when the refineries would be operating with minimal staff, reducing civilian casualties. The assembly of forces began immediately. The 9th Air Force in North Africa contributed 2 B-24 groups that were already in theatre, the 98th Pyramidas and the 376th Liberandos. The 8th Air Force in England temporarily transferred 3 groups, the 44th 8 Balls, the 93rd Travelling Circus, and the 389th Sky Scorpions, which was so new it hadn't even completed its first combat mission. 178 B-24 Liberators, 1,751 airmen, all converging on dusty airfields around Benghazi, Libya, in the last week of June 1943. What followed was the most intensive training regimen yet devised for a bombing mission. The crews didn't just practice formation, flying, or bombing procedures. They rehearsed the entire mission, repeatedly, using a mock-up of Ploesti built in the Libyan desert. Intelligence officers had assembled every photograph, every map, every piece of information available about Ploesti. They'd even found oil industry executives who had worked at the refineries before the war and could describe the layout from memory. Using this information, they constructed detailed sand table models showing every building, every smokestack, every street in the target area. But they went further. In a remote section of desert, they laid out a full-scale reproduction of the refinery complexes using whatever materials were available. Barrels represented storage tanks. Poles marked the locations of cracking towers. Painted lines indicated roads and railroad tracks. The B-24 crews flew practice missions against this mock target. Navigators practiced identifying landmarks at high speed and low altitude. Bombardiers learned to recognize their specific targets. Pilots drilled on flying in tight formation just above the ground, where any mistake could cause a catastrophic collision. The navigation requirements were particularly demanding. The mission would require threading between mountain ranges, identifying specific towns and road junctions while flying at 300 feet, and hitting exact waypoints along a route that stretched over 1,200 miles. Every navigator studied maps until they could draw the route from memory. Every crew memorized what they were supposed to see at each checkpoint. They were told the mission would rely on radio silence until they reached the target. No communication between aircraft, no calls for help, nothing that German listening posts could intercept and use to determine the formation's destination. This meant that if aircraft became separated or lost, they would have to navigate independently, using only maps, compasses, and visual landmarks. The Liberators themselves received modifications. Additional fuel tanks were installed in the bomb bays, increasing range but reducing bomb capacity. The Norden bomb sights were removed and replaced with simpler low-level sights. Some aircraft received additional forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns operated by the pilot to suppress ground fire during the bomb run. Each bomber was assigned a specific target, not just a refinery, but a specific building within that refinery. The boiler house at Astra Romana, the cracking tower at Concordia Vega, the distillation plant at Standard Petrol Block. The mission planners had identified the most critical components at each facility and designated aircraft to hit them in a carefully choreographed sequence. The plan called for the 5 bomb groups to approach Ploesti from the northwest in a single wave. They would split up at designated points to attack their individual targets simultaneously, hitting 7 different refineries at virtually the same moment. The attack would last less than 30 minutes. By the time the smoke cleared, the theory went, Ploesti's refining capacity would be destroyed and Germany's oil supply would be crippled. It was a beautiful plan on paper, elegant, efficient, devastating. Every contingency had been considered, every variable accounted for. The crews had practiced until they could execute their assigned tasks in their sleep. And then, on the morning of August 1st, 1943, reality began to deviate from the plan in ways that would turn Operation Tidal Wave into a case study in how carefully prepared military operations can collapse into chaos. The takeoffs began at 0700 hours, 178 B-24 seconds, heavily loaded with fuel and bombs, lumbering down dusty runways in the North African heat. The Libyan sun was already fierce, and the desert air was thin. The bombers needed every inch of runway to get airborne. One aircraft, Kickapoo from the 376th Group, never made it off the ground. During its takeoff roll, something went wrong, possibly an engine failure, possibly an overload condition. The bomber crashed at the end of the runway and exploded, killing all 10 crew members. It was an ominous start, but the mission continued. 177 aircraft turned north toward the Mediterranean. The formation climbed to altitude over the sea, maintaining radio silence. The plan called for the groups to stay together in a single massive formation. But almost immediately, problems emerged. The lead groups, the 376th and 93rd, were flying with higher power settings than the trailing groups. This created a speed differential that began to stretch the formation out. Colonel John Killer Kane, commanding the 98th Group in the second wave, noticed the problem. He couldn't radio the lead groups because of the radio silence order. He couldn't speed up to close the gap without burning fuel his aircraft would need for the return trip. He could only watch as the distance between the two halves of the formation gradually increased. Over the Ionian Sea, disaster struck again. A B-24 called Wongo Wongo from the 376th Group began flying erratically. Witnesses described the aircraft fishtailing, as if the pilot had lost control. Then Wongo Wongo plunged into the sea and exploded. Wongo Wongo was piloted by Lieutenant Brian Flavelle. His death would become controversial because some accounts claimed he was carrying the mission's lead navigator. If true, the loss of that navigator might explain some of what followed. But post-mission investigations suggested the lead navigator was actually Captain Harold Wickland in Compton's aircraft. Regardless, the loss of Wongo Wongo was psychologically devastating to the crews who witnessed it. They hadn't even reached enemy territory, and 2 aircraft were already gone. Lieutenant Guy Ovine, a friend of Flavelle's, broke formation and descended to search for survivors. He found none. Realizing he couldn't catch up to the formation, Iovine turned back toward Libya. Another aircraft followed him back. The mission had lost 3 bombers before encountering a single enemy fighter. The formation continued northeast, passing the island of Corfu and entering the airspace over Albania. Here, they encountered the Pindus mountain range, peaks rising to 9,000 feet. The plan called for the bombers to climb to 11,000 feet to clear the mountains, then descend back to low altitude on the far side. Colonel Compton, leading the first wave, threaded his way between cloud formations at just enough altitude to clear the peaks safely. Colonel Kane, leading the second wave, encountered thicker weather and decided to go to execute a 360-degree turn to allow his groups to penetrate the clouds at different altitudes and reassemble on the far side. The maneuver cost precious time and further separated the two halves of the formation. By the time all 5 groups descended from the mountains into Romanian airspace, they were no longer flying as a single coordinated strike force. The 376th and 93rd were miles ahead. The 98th, 44th, and 389th were strung out behind. The element of surprise was already compromised because German listening posts had been tracking the formation since it left Libya. A Luftwaffe signals intelligence station in Athens had intercepted radio traffic from North Africa, indicating a large bomber formation was departing. The information was relayed to Fighter Command headquarters in Romania. German radar stations tracked the bombers as they crossed the Adriatic. Bulgarian observers spotted them over the mountains. By early afternoon, General Gerstenberg knew with certainty that Ploesti was the target, and his defences were coming to full alert. The American crews were unaware of this. Maintaining radio silence, they had no way to know that German fighters were already scrambling, that anti-aircraft crews were manning their guns, that smoke generator operators were preparing to obscure the refineries. As the B-24s descended to low altitude over Romanian farmland, flying north along pre-planned routes toward their initial waypoints, the crews got their first look at the terrain they'd memorized from maps and photographs. Green fields, scattered villages, road networks. Everything looked smaller and moved past faster than they'd expected at 300 feet. The formation reached Ploesti, a town 65 miles south of Ploesti, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. This was a critical waypoint. From here, the 389th Group was supposed to split off and head northwest to attack the refinery at Campina, 18 miles from the main Ploesti complex. The other 4 groups would continue north to Florești, then turn southeast for the final bomb run into Ploesti. The 389th departed on its separate route as planned. Colonel Jack Wood and his crews headed north, following valleys toward their isolated target. They would be the only group to attack their assigned objectives exactly as briefed. The other 4 groups continued north from Ploesti, 50 miles to Florești, then the turn to the southeast for the final approach. Halfway between Ploesti and Florești lay the small town of Târgoviște, population 3,000, notable only because it sat at a railroad junction. Târgoviște looked very similar to Florești when viewed from 300 feet at 300 miles per hour. Both towns had railroad lines converging on them. Both had similar road patterns. In the rehearsals over the Libyan mock-up, navigators had practiced distinguishing them, but the mock-up hadn't fully captured how difficult visual navigation would be at high speed and low altitude, with the afternoon sun creating haze. Captain Harold Wickland, in the lead aircraft, knew they weren't at Florești yet. He could see the landmarks. The timing was wrong. They needed to continue north. He called this information to Colonel Compton over the intercom. But Compton and General Ent, who was flying as mission commander in the co-pilot's position, were focused on something else. They'd been watching the ground, comparing it to their memorized routes, and they'd convinced themselves they were at Florești. At 2:45, Compton banked Târgoviște to the southeast. Behind him, 40 B-24s of the 376th Group followed their leader. Behind them, Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker, in Hell's Wench, leading the 93rd Group, faced an instant decision. His navigator was telling him this was the wrong turn. But Compton was the mission leader, flying with the commanding general. Breaking formation would shatter the carefully planned coordination of the attack. Baker chose to follow. 37 B-24s of the 93rd Group turned southeast behind the 376th. 77 bombers, carrying 770 airmen and 250 tons of bombs, were now flying toward Bucharest instead of Ploesti. They were heading directly toward the most heavily defended city in Romania, approaching from the south through the primary concentration of anti-aircraft batteries that Gerstenberg had positioned to defend against exactly this approach. Several navigators in the trailing aircraft realized the error immediately. They broke radio silence, calling frantic warnings. Wrong turn, that's not Ploesti. The transmissions crackled through headsets across the formation, but Compton and Ent either didn't hear them or chose to ignore them, pressing on toward what they believed was the correct heading. For approximately 5 minutes, the 77 bombers flew southeast. The crews could see Bucharest emerging on the horizon ahead. The city's distinctive landmarks, the royal palace, church spires, major boulevards, were unmistakable. This wasn't Ploesti. Every airman in the formation now understood that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker made his decision at 2:50 in the afternoon. Looking to his left, he spotted smokestacks rising from the Ploesti refineries, approximately 15 miles to the northwest. The 93rd Group's assigned targets were burning somewhere in that direction. Baker could continue following Compton toward Bucharest, or he could break formation and attack Ploesti from the wrong direction, without coordination with the other groups, abandoning the carefully rehearsed plan. Baker banked Hell's Wench, 90 degrees to the left. Behind him, 36 more B-24 seconds of the travelling circus followed their commander in a sweeping turn toward Ploesti. They were now approaching from the south instead of the northwest. The defences would be fully alert. The element of surprise was gone, and they would be attacking targets that were assigned to other groups, using an approach they'd never rehearsed. Colonel Compton, finally realizing his error, also turned back toward Ploesti. But instead of following Baker's northwesterly course, Compton executed an almost complete reversal, swinging his 376th Group around to approach from the south and west. The two groups were now converging on Ploesti from different angles, certain to interfere with each other's bomb runs. Meanwhile, 40 miles to the south, Colonel John Kane's 98th Group reached Ploesti, the actual initial point, at approximately 3 o'clock. Kane could see smoke rising from Ploesti ahead. He had no idea what was happening up there, no way to know that Baker and Compton had already begun their attacks from the wrong directions. Following the mission plan, Kane turned his group southeast and led them toward their assigned targets at the Astra Romana and Stour Romana refineries. Behind Kane, Colonel Leon Johnson's 44th Group and the trailing elements made the same turn at Ploesti. They were coming in exactly as planned, from the northwest, at precisely the altitude and heading they'd rehearsed. What they couldn't know was that their targets were already under attack, that fires were raging, that the defences were fully awake and tracking their approach. The 93rd Group reached the outskirts of Ploesti first, at approximately 2:55 in the afternoon. Baker's Hell's Wench led the formation at 300 feet, approaching the White 4 and White 5 target complexes refineries that were actually assigned to Kane's 98th Group and Johnson's 44th. The German and Romanian gunners had been waiting. Gerstenberg's defensive plan had anticipated attacks from multiple directions, and his gun positions offered overlapping fields of fire. As the B-24 seconds roared in at treetop level, the anti-aircraft batteries opened up with everything they had. The 88mm heavy guns fired high-explosive shells with time fuses, designed to detonate at specific altitudes. But at 300 feet, there wasn't enough time for the fuses to arm before the shells passed through the bomber formations. The heavy guns were almost useless against targets flying this low, but Gerstenberg had planned for that contingency. Mixed in with the heavy guns were hundreds of smaller caliber weapons, 20mm and 37mm automatic cannon, heavy machine guns firing incendiary and armor-piercing rounds. These weapons were devastating against low-flying aircraft. At 300 feet, the bombers were well within effective range, and the gunners couldn't miss. Hell's Wench was hit almost immediately. Incendiary rounds punctured the fuel tanks in the left wing. Fire erupted, spreading across the wing surface. Baker could have broken off, could have climbed away from the target and tried to reach neutral Turkey, less than 200 miles to the east. His crew could have bailed out over Romanian farmland. Instead, Baker held his course. He was leading the 93rd Group. If he broke formation, the aircraft following him might scatter. The mission was already in chaos. He wouldn't make it worse by abandoning his men. Hell's Wench continued toward the refinery, trailing flames, as Baker held his dying aircraft steady to give his bombardier a clear run to the target. Major John Gjerstad, flying as Baker's co-pilot, had already completed a full combat tour. He'd volunteered to fly one more mission, this one because of its importance. Now he watched fire crawl across the wing, watched the airspeed indicator fluctuate as the flames damaged control surfaces, and knew with certainty that he and Baker and their entire crew had perhaps 2 more minutes to live. The bombardier released the bombs. Hell's Wench staggered over the refinery complex, bombs tumbling toward the cracking towers below. Then the fire reached the main fuel tanks. The B-24 exploded in mid-air, disintegrating into burning fragments that rained down on the industrial complex. All 10 crew members were killed instantly. Baker and Gjerstad would both receive the Medal of Honor posthumously. Behind Hell's Wench, the rest of the 93rd Group plunged into the inferno. The refineries were already burning from Baker's bombs and the attacks by Compton's scattered formations. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, turning afternoon into twilight. Secondary explosions rocked the industrial complexes as storage tanks detonated and volatile chemicals ignited. The B-24 seconds flew through this chaos at 300 feet, so close to the ground that their propeller wash kicked up debris. Gunfire came from every direction, not just from the known anti-aircraft positions, but from the disguised guns Gerstenberg had hidden in haystacks and wrecked buildings. Tracers crisscrossed the sky like a deadly spiderweb. Lieutenant Norman Appold's Hadley's harem took a direct hit in the bomb bay. The high-explosive bombs detonated, vaporizing the aircraft and everyone aboard. Staff Sergeant William Dabney's aircraft lost an engine to ground fire, staggered, clipped a smokestack with its wing, and cartwheeled into the ground in a ball of flame. Aircraft were exploding in mid-air, crashing into buildings, disintegrating under the weight of fire. But the survivors pressed through. Bombardiers released their weapons on whatever targets presented themselves through the smoke. Some managed to hit their assigned buildings, others just dropped on any structure that looked important. The refineries were taking damage, but at a cost that was rapidly becoming unsustainable. Of the 37 B-24 seconds from the 93rd Group that entered Ploesti, 8 went down before clearing the target area. 9 more were so badly damaged they'd never reach Libya. The travelling circus was being slaughtered. Colonel Compton's 376th Group attacked from the west at approximately the same time, adding to the confusion. Some of his aircraft bombed the Concordia Vega refinery. Others, unable to identify targets through the smoke, dropped their bombs on whatever looked important and fled south toward the relative safety of the Bulgarian border. Then, at 3:05, Colonel Kane's 98th Group arrived from the northwest, following the original plan. Kane's aircraft dropped to 50 feet, not 300, not 200, but 50 feet above the ground, threading between smokestacks and storage tanks. His bombardier had been briefed to hit specific buildings at the Astra Romana refinery. Those buildings were now burning from the bombs dropped by Baker's group, attacking from the wrong direction. Kane made an instant decision. His crews would attack targets of opportunity, anything that hadn't already been hit. The 98th Group scattered across the refinery complex, individual aircraft hunting for intact structures. It was improvised, chaotic, nothing like the carefully orchestrated plan they'd rehearsed. But it was the only option that made sense. Second Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes, flying the Sandman, was approaching the refinery when his aircraft was hit. Fuel streamed from punctured tanks in the wings, vaporizing in the slipstream. The fuel ignited. The Sandman was flying through its own fuel trail, essentially a flying blowtorch. The left wing was on fire, the flames growing more intense by the second. Hughes had the same choice Baker had faced minutes earlier: break off or continue to target. His assigned buildings were intact, visible through the smoke. If he turned away, those structures would survive. Hughes held his course. The Sandman flew through a curtain of ground fire, released its bombs directly on target, then crashed into the refinery complex moments later. The explosion was visible for miles. Hughes would receive a posthumous Medal of Honor. Behind Kane, Colonel Johnson's 44th Group attacked the Columbia Aquila refinery at 3:10. They approached from the northwest as planned, only to find their path blocked by delayed fuse bombs dropped by earlier groups. Some of the bombs dropped by Baker's aircraft had been set with delays of up to 45 seconds, designed to explode after the attacking aircraft had cleared the area. But the timing was based on the original attack plan. Now, with groups attacking at irregular intervals, the delayed bombs were detonating under aircraft that arrived later. Lieutenant William Brandon's aircraft flew directly over a bomb that detonated beneath it. The blast flipped the B-24, inverted, shattering its back, and the aircraft plunged into the ground with no survivors. Johnson himself flew through explosions and fires, his aircraft taking hit after hit, fuel streaming from punctured tanks. Somehow, Susie Q survived the bomb run and limped away from Ploesti with 2 engines failing and half the flight controls shot away. Johnson would receive the Medal of Honor, one of only 2 recipients to survive the mission. The attack lasted approximately 35 minutes, from Baker's initial strike at 2:55 until the last bombers cleared the target area at 3:30. 35 minutes of sustained low-altitude bombing through defenses that were fully alert and aggressively engaged. No bomber crew in the European theatre had ever faced anything like it. The German and Romanian fighters had been scrambled when the formations were first detected, but most arrived too late to intercept the bombers over the target. The B-24 seconds were simply moving too fast at low altitude, and the attack was over before the fighters could position themselves effectively. They did, however, attack the bombers as they withdrew, adding to the losses. Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds dove on the damaged bombers, struggling to gain altitude after clearing Ploesti. Romanian fighters joined the pursuit. Gunners in the B-24 seconds fired back with their 50 caliber turrets, but aircraft that had already taken damage over the refineries were vulnerable. Several bombers that survived the target area were shot down during the withdrawal. The surviving aircraft fled in all directions. Some headed west toward Yugoslavia and the Adriatic, hoping to make it back across the Mediterranean. Others turned south toward Bulgaria and Greece. A few, too damaged to make the long flight to Libya, limped east toward neutral Turkey, where the crews would be interned for the duration of the war, but at least survive. Far to the north, Colonel Wood's 389th Group completed their attack on the Campina refinery complex exactly as planned. They'd approached from the north, hit their targets with precision, and withdrawn with relatively light losses. The 389th was the only group to execute their mission according to the rehearsed plan, largely because they'd been assigned a separate target away from the main Ploesti complex, and thus avoided the chaos caused by the navigation error. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky over Ploesti was empty of American aircraft. The refineries were burning. Smoke columns reached 10,000 feet, visible for 50 miles. 700 Romanian civilians were dead, many killed when Lieutenant Jose Carioca's damaged B-24 crashed into a women's prison in the city. Dozens of refinery workers had been killed in the explosions. The industrial complexes were wrecked, with critical structures destroyed or heavily damaged. But the price had been catastrophic. Of the 177 B-24 seconds that departed Libya that morning, only 88 returned to base. 33 had been shot down over Romania. 7 more crashed in various locations trying to reach friendly territory. 11 landed in Turkey and were interned. The air crews lost over Ploesti included 310 men killed, 108 captured by the Germans or Romanians, and 78 interned in Turkey. The casualty rate was over 30% of the attacking force, making Operation Tidal Wave proportionally the costliest air raid the United States Army Air Forces would conduct during the entire war. 5 Medals of Honor were awarded, 3 posthumously more than for any other single air action in American history. 56 Distinguished Service Crosses followed. The mission would forever be remembered as Black Sunday. And for what? In the days following the raid, reconnaissance aircraft photographed the damage. British and American intelligence analyzed the images, calculated the destruction, and estimated how long it would take Germany to restore Ploesti's output. The assessment was devastating. 2 of the refineries, Steaua Romana and Columbia Aquila, had been severely damaged and would be out of operation for months. but 5 of the 7 major complexes were back to partial operation within days. The Germans brought in repair crews, salvaged undamaged equipment, and rebuilt critical structures with remarkable speed. By November 1943, just 3 months after the raid, Ploesti's total output had not only recovered, but actually exceeded pre-raid production levels. The Germans had been forced to improve their processes, had brought in more efficient equipment for the repairs, and had reorganized the refinery operations in ways that increased efficiency. Operation Tidal Wave had cost 532 American airmen killed, wounded, or captured. It had destroyed or damaged 53 B-24 Liberators, and it had accomplished exactly nothing in terms of its strategic objective. Germany's oil supply was not curtailed. The war was not shortened. The sacrifice had been for nothing. Or had it? The question would haunt military analysts for decades. What went wrong? How did such a carefully planned, extensively rehearsed mission turn into such a disaster? The navigation error at Târgoviște was the immediate cause of the chaos, certainly. If Compton had continued to Ploesti as planned, if the groups had attacked simultaneously from the northwest as rehearsed, the outcome might have been different. Maybe, but even a perfect execution of the original plan faced fundamental problems that were baked into the mission from the beginning. The first problem was strategic. The planners had assumed that a single devastating raid could cripple Ploesti's output for an extended period. This assumption was based on a misunderstanding of how modern industrial facilities could be repaired. Yes, the bombs destroyed critical structures, but refineries are modular systems. Damage one cracking tower, and production shifts to other units. Destroy a boiler house, and temporary steam generation equipment can be brought in. The Germans had demonstrated throughout the war a remarkable ability to restore damaged industrial facilities, and the Allies should have anticipated this. The second problem was tactical. Low-altitude attacks by heavy bombers were, as many officers had predicted, essentially suicide missions. The B-24 was designed for high-altitude operations. At 300 feet, it was vulnerable to every weapon the defenders possessed. The argument that surprise would protect the bombers had proven false. German intelligence had tracked the formation from Libya, and the defences were fully alert before the first bombs fell. The third problem was the fundamental assumption that precision mattered. The mission had been planned around hitting specific buildings, this boiler house, that cracking tower, this distillation, the plant. But when the formations arrived over Ploesti in broad daylight, through smoke and fire and explosions, precision became impossible. Bombardiers dropped on whatever they could see through the chaos. The carefully assigned targets were largely irrelevant, but the mission did accomplish something, though it took historians decades to fully understand it. Operation Tidal Wave terrified the Germans. The fact that the Americans could reach Ploesti from Libya, that they were willing to attempt such a daring and costly raid, sent a message to Berlin that nowhere in occupied Europe was safe. The psychological impact was significant. More importantly, the raid forced the Germans to heavily reinforce Ploesti's defences. Gerstenberg received additional anti-aircraft guns, more fighters, more troops. All of those resources, the guns, the ammunition, the aircraft, the fuel, the trained personnel, were diverted from other fronts where they were desperately needed. Every gun defending Ploesti was a gun that wasn't defending the Ruhr or Hamburg or Berlin, and Ploesti remained a target. The single raid in August 1943 wasn't the end. In April 1944, the newly formed 15th Air Force, operating from captured airfields in southern Italy, began a sustained bombing campaign against the Romanian refineries. These were high-altitude raids, using the tactics the air forces had always preferred, with fighter escorts protecting the bombers. The campaign lasted from April through August 1944, with American bombers hitting Ploesti repeatedly. 24 major raids, thousands of sorties. The refineries were bombed again and again, until the cumulative damage finally overwhelmed the German repair efforts. By August 1944, when Soviet forces captured Romania and seized the Ploesti complex intact, production had fallen to a fraction of its 1943 levels, so the strategic objective, denying oil to Germany was eventually achieved, but it required sustained attacks over months, not a single spectacular raid. The cost of the 1944 campaign was also heavy. 222 more bombers lost, thousands more casualties, but the losses were spread across months of operations, not concentrated in a single afternoon of carnage. The veterans of Black Sunday scattered after the mission. Some returned to their groups in England or North Africa and continued flying combat missions. Others were too badly wounded and went home. The men who'd been captured spent the rest of the war in German POW camps. Those interned in Turkey waited out the war in relative comfort, eventually repatriated in 1944 when Turkey broke relations with Germany. Colonel Compton and General Ent both received Distinguished Service Crosses for their actions at Ploesti, which generated controversy among the survivors. Many felt that the men who led the formation into the wrong turn shouldn't be decorated, while better navigators had been killed trying to fix the error. But the medals stood. Captain Harold Wickland, the navigator who'd tried to warn Compton about the wrong turn, survived the war. In post-mission interviews, he was diplomatic about what happened that afternoon, refusing to explicitly criticize his superiors. But his navigation logs, preserved in official records, show that he marked Târgoviște on his map with a notation IP1, not IP2. Attempted to advise AC aircraft commander of error. Colonel John Kane survived and continued flying missions in the Mediterranean theatre. His decision to attack from 50 feet, flying between smokestacks with his landing gear almost scraping the ground, became legendary. Kane received the Medal of Honor, one of the 5 awarded for Ploesti, and one of the 2 recipients who survived to receive it. Colonel Leon Johnson, his aircraft shot to pieces, made it back to Libya with 2 engines out, and most of his flight controls destroyed. His co-pilot would later describe the return flight as a 3-hour exercise in desperation, nursing a dying bomber across 600 miles of hostile territory. Johnson received the Medal of Honor and continued flying combat missions until the end of the war. The wreckage of the B-24s shot down over Romania remained scattered across the landscape for years. Some crashed in fields and were scavenged for metal. Others came down in forests and weren't discovered until long after the war ended. Local Romanians buried the dead where they fell, often marking the graves with makeshift crosses. After the war, American recovery teams located these burial sites and returned the remains home. The Ploesti refineries, damaged by American bombs in 1943 and 1944, then seized by the Soviets, operated under communist control until Romania's revolution in 1989. Some of the facilities continued producing oil until the early 2000s, when they were finally closed due to age and environmental concerns. You can still see some of the structures today, cracking towers and storage tanks, rusted and abandoned, monuments to the industrial complex that once fueled Hitler's war machine and became the target of one of the most notorious raids in military history. The navigation error that turned Operation Tidal Wave into a disaster has been analysed in countless military studies and staff college courses. It's become a case study in what happens when command authority overrides expert advice, when mission complexity exceeds the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, when the fog of war transforms careful plans into chaos. There was no banned star chart that let B-24s bomb Ploesti from 50 feet in total darkness. The truth is somehow more remarkable and more tragic. 177 heavy bombers attacked in broad daylight at altitudes that made them vulnerable to every weapon the Germans possessed. They flew into a firestorm because a colonel and a general made a wrong turn, and the command structure didn't allow for correction. The men who flew that mission were neither reckless nor incompetent. They were highly trained professional air crews, executing a plan that was fundamentally flawed from its inception. The navigation error at Târgoviște certainly made everything worse, but even perfect navigation wouldn't have changed the core problem. Low-altitude attacks by heavy bombers against heavily defended targets produce catastrophic casualties. The air forces learned from Ploesti. Never again would they attempt such a mission. The doctrine of high-altitude precision bombing, which Tidal Wave had been designed to circumvent, was vindicated. When the 15 Air Force returned to Ploesti in 1944, They came at 20,000 feet with fighter escorts, and they came back repeatedly until the job was done. But the men who died on Black Sunday never saw that. Vindication. Lieutenant Colonel Baker and Major Gerstad, flying Hell's Wench into the flames. Second Lieutenant Hughes in the Sandman, continuing to target while his aircraft burned. The crews of the 93rd Travelling Circus, first into the inferno. The pilots and navigators and bombardiers and gunners who pressed through the smoke and fire because their orders said to attack and their training said to complete the mission. 310 men killed in action over Ploesti that afternoon. Their names are carved into the tablets of the missing at the American Military Cemetery in Carthage, Tunisia, for those whose bodies were never recovered. For those who were buried in Romania and later repatriated, their graves are scattered across America, in small-town cemeteries and national military burial grounds, each marked with a simple stone that gives no hint of the chaos and violence they experienced in their final moments. The strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany would ultimately succeed. The combined efforts of the American 8th and 15th Air Forces, along with RAF Bomber Command, would destroy Germany's industrial capacity and contribute significantly to Allied victory. But that success would be built on hard lessons learned from failures like Ploesti. Sometimes in war, courage and sacrifice aren't enough. Sometimes careful planning and extensive training aren't enough. Sometimes you can do everything right and still fail because the mission itself was impossible. Operation Tidal Wave was one of those missions. The men who flew it were heroes. The mission they were asked to accomplish was beyond the capabilities of the aircraft and tactics available in 1943. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Ploesti. Not that navigation errors doom missions, though they certainly don't help. Not that low-altitude attacks are suicidal, though the casualty figures proved that conclusively. The real lesson is that strategic bombing is a campaign, not an event. You don't shorten a war with a single spectacular raid. You shorten it through sustained pressure, through coming back day after day and week after week until the enemy's ability to resist is finally broken. The men who bombed Ploesti on August 1st, 1943, couldn't know that they were part of a learning process. They thought they were ending the war early. Instead, they became a case study in what not to do, and their sacrifice helped the Air Forces develop the tactics that would eventually succeed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.